Review of the Lord of the Rings series. The last part. Sauron's identity is finally revealed. Throughout the first 7 episodes of The Lord of the Rings of Power, we all wondered who Sauron was and where he had been the whole time, as even Galadriel and the other elves couldn't find out his whereabouts after searching. However, there were plenty of clues that allowed us to make up our own minds about Sauron's identity, as he has always been among us and the characters in the show. The Season 1 finale of Rings of Power finally allowed us to see where the series is going and who Sauron really is, as the suspects were narrowed down to 2, the Stranger and Halbrand. Of course, the opening scene of the final episode titled Alloyed may have misled many, but that's what the show has been doing all along. Stay with me as we take a look at what happened in the final episode of The Lord of the Rings of Power. This is you and the Lord of the Rings series review at the final station. At the very beginning, as a criticism and complaint about the first season of the Lord of the Rings series, I must say, The Rings of Power was a very mixed bag. While the second half of the series was filled with spectacular action, unpredictable twists, and some truly impressive characters, there was no avoiding the slow pace and drudgery that occurred during the first few episodes. For a long time, it felt like nothing was really happening in the story, and this no doubt turned a significant portion of its audience off the show forever. After all, there's no point in spending 3 or 4 hours of television just setting the tone for a season if it doesn't keep the majority of the audience watching. With these interpretations, the 8th and final episode entitled Alloyed brought down the curtain on the first season of Rings of Power. But looking at this season, the major structural problems of this 8-part series are still visible. The first season of Rings of Power is incredibly awkward from a narrative perspective. This was a constant problem throughout the series. But why? Because the audience, often found it difficult to tell if the main story threads were unfolding in parallel as a result, or if some were moving faster than others. For example, in the first half of the series, it was clear as day that the main characters were stuck in a narrative deadlock, waiting for the rest of the plot around them to progress to a point where they could meaningfully join the action or the developing story. This not mentioned in the series was more about Galadriel Morfydd Clark and was revealed in the first half of the season. Because in the time interval between his introduction in the episode Shadow of the Past and his final return to Middle-earth in the episode Uden, we saw a disconnection in this character. As a reminder, it's worth a quick recap of Galadriel's story. Galadriel is threatened by a sea monster in Adrift, and then transported to Numenor in Adar, where he spends 3 whole episodes boarding and disembarking in a boat, as he tries to bring an army to the boat to accompany him to fight the orcs in the southern lands. During these episodes, Galadriel should meet Halbrand Charlie Vickers, and the show should establish some of Numenor's internal politics around characters like Muriel Cynthia Adi Robinson, Elendil Lloyd Owen, and even Faraz and Tristan Gravel. However, these all amount to useless structuring that don't help the story in any way. These things seem to be something that the creators do out of a sense of commitment to the source, because Galadriel cannot reach Middle-earth before the episode Uden. In this way, and with many delays, the heavy burden of advancing the narrative and story between the characters and some mysteries fell on the shoulders of its final 2 episodes. As a result of this totally wrong policy, Episode Vi has the reverse problem. This means that while the earlier episodes of Rings of Power suffered from trapping characters in pointless narrative segments, the episode Alloyed is packed with plot. Unlike the others, this episode has a lot of ground to cover to bring its various plot threads to satisfying conclusions at the end of the first season. If the beginning of the season was too slow, the episode Alloyed moves too quickly. In this episode, the charming stranger Dale Wyman encounters the mysterious White Robes who bravely identify him as Sauron. They try to reawaken his memories and convince the stranger that he is indeed the Dark Lord. This storyline leads to these people confronting the Harfoots and discovering that the stranger is not actually Sauron, but one of the Istar, or sorcerers. This plot was enough for the entire episode, but the producer's lack of coverage of the story makes it merge with another main line where Sauron seeks to create Rings of Power by Celebrimbor Charles Edwards. Again, There's a lot of intrigue going on here, with Halbrand manipulating Celebrimbor, King Gil-galad Benjamin Walker growing cold to have hope, and Galadriel realizing Halbrand is actually Sauron. Of course, it makes sense for these two plots to come to fruition in parallel, especially in the final episode. After all, those were the two big standalone story threads throughout the show's first season that should have been resolved in the finale as the two remaining big mystery boxes at the heart of the story. The problem, however, is that the episode Alloyed has to do a lot to get these threads moving properly, and then it has to resolve them in one episode of the series. This is a messy structure. Honestly, a lot of the setup for these stories should have been done earlier in the season. For example, the penultimate episode of the season, entitled The Eye, should have prepared the narrative paths for these big revelations. After all, these plots were both planted early in the season. The stranger fell to Middle-earth at the end of the first episode, Shadow of the Past, and Celebrimbor was also introduced in the second episode. However, they never really took off. While Galadriel spent half the season in Numenor, there's absolutely no excuse to leave these characters idle in the middle of nowhere. In fact, the decision to hold off on these plots for 7 episodes seems to be influenced by pessimistic outside factors unrelated to the actual story. The creators of the Rings of Power refrained from introducing these two storylines until the end of the season, as actually advancing them would have opened the show's two remaining big mystery boxes. And this is due to the weakness of the story. A big problem in the storyline of the Rings of Power series was the dependence of the series on the same two mysteries. The narrative of this series was highly dependent on its two mystery nodes, and this is due to following a formula. The formula that was popularized on TV with the success of Lost series, but it arguably fell out of fashion in the years since, in part because of how easily these same puzzles can get in the way of storytelling. Now, the final episode of the Lord of the Rings series is also a victim of this formulation. It seems that the creators of the Rings of Power kept the two plots neutral because as soon as they started to unravel, the end of their little story would be revealed. If the creators of Power Rings did a reasonable job and gave these plans a space to breathe starting in the 7th episode, the answers and unraveling of this episode would have been better for the audience. With these interpretations, these two seemingly mysterious mysteries seemed to be solved in the first few episodes. Many viewers identified the stranger as a wizard, probably Gandalf, and Halbrand as Sauron from the start. However, the answers were so obvious that they raised questions about the importance of maintaining the mystery for so long. There's nothing wrong with puzzles that the audience can easily solve, but if they're too long, they're ultimately unconvincing. The result of cramming all these convoluted plots into one episode to maintain a set of mysteries is that there is no more room to work with the characters. For example, in this episode the character Zotic Bros Lenny Henry dies trying to protect a stranger, but the audience still doesn't really know who Zotic Bros really is beyond being played by the entertaining Lenny Henry. And this is a big gap. But with all these ups and downs, the first season of the Lord of the Rings series has now come to an end. The first season, which was neither desirable nor a historical failure. Looking at the length of the season, we will see that the creators tried to build a seemingly structured background for the formation and entry of the front of good and evil into a classic story. But a slow process and of course some big mistakes in the heart of the story made a huge group of audiences stop watching the series. But those who are left can enjoy an action-adventure in the next seasons.